Evolution of HRM basically started off in the year 1890s to 1913, where basically it is called as welfare officer, where most of the HR department was considered as a welfare department. And here, when we talk in terms of these things, it will take us to way back to something called as the industrial revolutions, where managing of workers at the companies started off with something called as in the late 18th century. Before this era, many large organizations existed, but without the advanced technology, it was hard to maintain them. And during this time, most of the organization would always like to work in an atmosphere which was very much unfavorable, and the employees always used to put in endless hours to work in a company for a very little pay. And this was the time where uh, most of the organizations started to use something called as scientific way of managing people, which always they started to gather one of the best way to handle every role that was existing in most of the organization, and their key priority was to make it more efficient and as well as to make it to run more smoothly. And in most of the cases, in this part of the stage, they used to think that keeping employees trained on a timely basis will always help them to achieving their objectives. And during this time, we started to look at something like having something which is greatly related towards the applicability of enhancing the overall productivity of the organization. And these things are considered as the basic time where the evolution of HRM basically started. And when we look at the next stage where it is called as the labor manager, where the employees were basically treated as something called as laborers, and that was a time where any person who has been employed as an HR were basically will be called as a labor manager. And after that, when we look at the time period between 1945 to 1970, where we started to have something called as a personal management, where they started to look at procuring the employees as well as developing them in a right manner. And all these things started in the late 70s and began to have a very good revolution in the late 1980s. And during this ancient period, for a very long period of time, many organizations would always like to achieve different sort of factors evolve around from time to time to meet the changing needs of an organization. And that was a time where they started to look at something called as the administrative HRM, where it was primarily responsible with respect to something called as record keeping as well as the complaints with the employment laws and regulations. And this was a time where their key focus was looking at something called as their transactional activities such as hiring payrolls as well as benefiting the administration. And later on, we come across something called as the human resource management, which was considered as a key factors with respect to looking at how well they're able to procure their employees, develop them, and motivate them in order to make sure that how well they're able to make the best utilization of their available talent. And that was a time where employers were a little bit sympathetic. They were showing a lot of sympathy towards their workers with respect to meeting their needs and requirements on a timely basis. And this was a time where labor laws were renewed, according to which they started to abolish something called as a child labor, and workers were started to get proper training and other things. and they were trained on a timely basis to make sure that how well they are able to use the machineries which have been offered by their employees. And even the wages were also started to get very high, and employees started to get a very good working conditions, which always help the workers to be more productive, and which in turn contributed towards the growth of the organization. So all these things are one of the important things what we can see with respect to evolution of the HRM. And the next thing we'd like to discuss is with respect to the functions of HRM. Basically, the functions of HRM are classified into two important categories. One is the managerial functions, another one is the operative functions. When we talk in terms of managerial functions, we are looking at something like planning, organization, directing, and controlling. And as discussed earlier, when we talk in terms of planning, it basically focuses on something called as HRP, which is nothing but human resource planning. And at this point, this function of HRM mainly focuses on the number and type of the employees that are basically needed to something like accomplishing of the organizational goals, which are basically predetermined. And apart from that, equal number of importance will also be given to something like the research, where companies always try to collect valid information to identify what are the key or the current trends, and what would be the future trends that are going to prevail in the environment. And keeping all those things in mind, they always tend to plan their human resource needs to forecast the changing attitudes as well as the changing environment that are basically prevailing in the organizations. And in turn, all these things are going to have a greater impact on the organization. And second important functions we are looking at is in terms of organizing. Organizing a task are nothing but allocation among its members, or having a very good relationship within an organization, which are basically focusing on in the context of identified activities, which always tend to get itself integrated towards achieving a common objective. And nowadays, we are seeing organization are pretty much well organized with respect to establishing a very good rapport with their employees, so that they can collectively contribute as with respect to attaining the organizational goals, which is pretty much it is considered as a need of an hour. And third thing is with respect to directing, which basically focuses towards activating employees at a different levels, and making them to contribute towards the maximum level uh, in line with the organization. And these things always helps the organization with respect to tapping the maximum potential of the employees, which is possible through their motivation and command. And the last part in managerial function is towards the controlling. After planning, organization, and directing, the employee's actual performance is checked, verified, and compared with the plans. If the actual performance is found to deviate from the plan, proper control measures are required, and the same actions has to be implemented. And next thing is with respect to operational functions, which basically starts off with the HRD, and we are mainly focusing on something like human resource development, compensation, HR relations, industrial relations, and we are also focusing something towards the trends in HRM. And later on, we need to look at something like recruitment and selection, job analysis and designs, performance appraisals, which are considered as the key functional aspects of any organization which are in operational functionality. And we also look at how well we are able to give employment to the organization, and so on and so forth. And we should also give equal importance to something like employee welfare, maintenance, wherein which human resources are always considered as an asset for the organization, and we should also focus towards something called as employee turnover, which is always considered to be a very good habit for the organization. HRM always tries to keep the best performing employees within an organization. That is also an important thing that most of the organization would always tend to follow.